So most all of you by now know what a Roth IRA is. It's a retirement account that you can put money into. The money goes in after tax, but everything that goes in the Roth and everything that it makes is tax-free later when you take it out, commonly 59.5. But I got this question and I thought it was interesting. How can I use my Roth IRA as an emergency fund? And it made me really think about it because at first I just wanted to say, well, you really can't and you shouldn't. But let's dive into this. So you roll into some hard times, we all have, and you need some money to make it through the challenges. So you're wondering, how can I use my Roth IRA as an emergency fund? I guess, it's not a terrible idea. It could work. There'd be some things you'd need to do, but what if I just told you that actually that is a terrible idea and I have a better solution? Wouldn't that just be easier? Because then I don't need to kind of dance around and tell you something that I don't truly believe in. Let me just give you a better solution for an emergency fund. As a matter of fact, I'm going to give you a couple of them. Let's dive in. So first, instead of the government setting the rules of how you can take your money out of that Roth IRA and use that money, because the Roth IRA, even though you do have access to the money after the first 5 years, you still have 10% early penalty fee. They still have a lot of rules. You can only put so much money in, and if you make too much money, they phase you out from even contributing to it. So all those are check marks as to why we wouldn't want to use a Roth as a legitimate emergency fund. Instead, what I would do is I would want to create an account that has some similarities to a Roth, and I would take the money that normally would go into the Roth, and I'll change one thing, and that's where the money goes. And that place that I'm talking about is a privatized banking policy. Commonly, it goes by Infinite Banking Concept Policy, or IBC Policy. What is it? Specially designed and engineered whole life insurance policy from a mutually owned company that pays dividends. So why would I want to do that? Well, first, the main thing you need to understand is a Roth IRA, the reason people put money there is because it's tax-free. The privatized banking policy, that specially designed whole life, is also tax-free. The internal buildup in the policy grows tax-free. So if that's the main objective you had for the Roth, well, this is pretty much the same. Tax-free environment. But the second thing that you need to understand is the private banking policy does not have any of those government rules that don't allow you to take the money before 59.5 without a penalty. They don't have limitations on how much money you can put into them. It's based on your human life value, so that can be a lot. Sometimes millions of dollars can go into them without any restrictions. And when you need the money, you click a couple buttons and the money makes it back into your account. That, to me, seems like a much better place to call an emergency fund. Because an emergency fund, you're going to need that money immediately. A Roth IRA is not immediate when you take that money out. There's forms. You got to go through a little bit of a process to get it. The policy, not so much. It's very easy to take money out.
Take the money out! All of it!
So let's talk about another option. This one's definitely not my favorite, but number 2 on the list would be a checking or savings account, maybe a money market account. They're immediately liquid. We all know and understand them. And it's not a bad idea in common knowledge to keep 3 to 6 months of household expenses in one of these bank accounts. Not a terrible idea, because if something happens, you can just take the money out, you can write a check, you can use your debit card, and boom, you're taking care of that emergency fund situation and that challenge that came up. But the problem is with this, right now, inflation's running hot. So we're in 2022, this is August, so inflation's 9.1%. So any dollar you have in a checking or savings account sitting there for this emergency that may or may not ever happen is literally being eaten up by inflation, which is nothing more than a hidden tax. You can write your congressman and say,
hey, thanks for taxing me even more.
When you said, I wasn't going to get taxed because I make less than $400,000. Welcome to the big lie. Inflation is a hidden tax, and it's eating your money alive. So the second option isn't really a great option given the times we're in. So let's look at another one where maybe you might want to consider. Because if inflation is the concern and we want a short-term solution to solve that inflation problem of eating your money in your savings account up, why don't we look at something that the government does offer that would benefit you? These are called TIPS, Treasury Inflation Protected Securities. On the street, they go by the common name of I-bonds. The nice thing about TIPS is exactly in the name. They're inflation-protected securities. They're bonds issued by the U.S. government, so they're backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government, which is not guaranteed, but pretty darn close, because the U.S. government has never defaulted on any one of their debts, and I doubt they're going to start soon. So when we talk about that 3 to 6 months of household expenses, that might run into a problem with this option, because TIPS, which are now open, treasurydirect.gov, that's where you buy TIPS, okay? They just came, the auction opened in May, it closes in October, so you're running out of time with this one. But if you want the TIPS that pay the 9.1%, you can buy $10,000 per person or per entity or per trust. So if it's you and your spouse, that's 2. So that means you can buy up to $10,000 there. But why would you want TIPS? Well, because they pay interest in excess of what inflation is right now. So if inflation's 9.1, the TIPS, I think right now are paying 9.6. It's better. So you're not losing to inflation, and the money is still accessible after 12 months. That's a problem. So if you're looking for an emergency fund today, you have to understand the money you put in TIPS is not going to be able to be used for at least 12 months. That's an important thing to consider here. But if that's not a concern, if 12 months and 1 day you need the money for an emergency that hits, the worst part about that is the government is going to take back 3 months of interest. So based on what they're paying today, if we subtract 3 months of interest, your net would roughly be about 7.77%. Still, a heck of a lot better than your savings or checking account. So the fourth one has been pretty common lately, and I don't think this is such a bad idea. A backup plan for an emergency fund that allows all of the money you have, the money that you would have normally put in a tip, the money you normally would have put into the savings, or the money that you normally would have put into the privatized banking policy or the Roth, doesn't need to be put away for a rainy day or an emergency if you take advantage of this. This backup plan is none other than those credit cards. Now, I want to be very clear about this. This credit card that is going to serve as your emergency fund should only be used in an emergency. So what does that mean? Well, first off, if you're going to get this credit card, make sure that it has a balance that at least equals 6 to 12 months of your expenses. Otherwise, it's not going to be enough for the emergencies that might come up. And you don't ever use this card unless it's a true emergency. So how do we constitute and quantify what an emergency is? Every family's different. So why don't you just grab a piece of paper and you just write, all right, this would be an emergency. If the hot water tank goes, if the furnace goes, if the car breaks down, if this or that or this or that. Just write down a list of all the things and then put that list in an envelope, put the credit card in the envelope, seal it, put it in the safe. No one has access to this card unless it fits one of those parameters. Now, you're not putting yourself in harm's way with having a credit card when your spouse goes to that expensive store, Coach, Gucci, Armani, all those places, and sees that bag that just somehow becomes an emergency that they have to buy the bag. And stranger things have happened, but in my household, this would probably happen. You know, that bag just happened to be an emergency. Honey, why was it an emergency? Why did you have to use the credit card for that?
Honey, it was on sale and the sale ended tomorrow. I thought that was an emergency. I had to have it.
So, again, lock that son of a bitch up in the safe. Don't give it to your wife. Don't give it to your husband either. I'm not saying we're any better because, hey, we might not be buying Gucci purses, but send us to the dirt bike store. That card is going to be maxed out before we leave that shop. Just saying, to each their own. So make sure you know what your emergency is. So let's do a quick recap. So we talked about, can your Roth be used for an emergency fund? And I didn't like that idea. So the first suggestion I made is a Roth-like account called a whole life policy, but especially designed and engineered whole life. And then we could basically keep the money in there where it earns a higher interest rate. The second thing I said wasn't my favorite either. And the second thing we talked about is keeping 3 to 6 months in a checking or savings account. But the problem with the option number 2 is inflation's running hot. So every single month of every year, you're losing money to inflation. So then I said, number 3, if inflation was the concern and it's a temporary problem, well, let's answer that with a temporary solution called TIPS, Treasury Inflation Protected Securities, commonly known as I-bonds. They pay more than what inflation is today, and you can buy $10,000 of them. The fourth thing we talked about is one that I really like, because it gave you the ability to take all your usable capital and send that money out to work while your emergency fund was just a piece of plastic called a credit card, but a credit card that had a set of rules. Those rules are what constitutes an emergency in your family. And you write those rules down, you take them, you put it in an envelope, you put the credit card in there, and you lock it in a safe. Those are my different suggestions of what you should do for an emergency fund versus using a Roth IRA, which could have negative things happen like taxes and penalties if you used it wrong. Folks, if you like this video, check this one out. Is buying land on Mars a good investment? I get all sorts of weird questions, and well, is buying land on Mars a good investment, or is it just a dumb question? Watch the video and you will make your own assumption.